to do over the next few weeks, and we'll see how far we can get, is that next time I'd like to either continue what we've started tonight and then begin a discussion of the story of creation and its alignment with the Big Bang Theory. The next topic that is a very important topic, which is, were Chazal expert scientists or not? And how do we deal with scientific inaccuracy when we find it within the words of our sages? Then I'd like to talk about intelligent design and evolution and how we integrate that, see if that is integratable within Torah. And then finally, if we have some time, a little bit more of a specific topic, which is Torah and physics, the uncertainty principle, and the need for an observer. Now, we may not be able to get to that topic, but we're going to go from the general to the specific and see how far that we can get in these discussions. Objectives and goals of Torah and science. One would be tempted to suggest that the goal of life of Torah versus the goals of the life of science are really at odds with each other. Because what is a life of science or scientific inquiry, or a person who dedicates their life to science? What are they really dedicating themselves to? They're dedicating themselves to inquiry, to a pursuit of knowledge. And here we really need to identify that when we speak about modern science, we are talking about a discipline that goes back thousands of years, even though some date modern science to the very end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern period, sometime in the 17th century, with the advent of modern scientific method. But it would be a mistake to say that science begins in the 17th century. Science has been around since the times of the ancients, the Greeks, the Babylonians. Astronomy, mathematics, physics has been around in one form or another since ancient times. It has gone by different names. The term science is really a repackaging of what used to be known as philosophy. Now, philosophy for us is something that we study if we're interested in the humanities. But that's not what philosophy was originally. Philosophia, which is really what it is a love of knowledge. And a love of knowledge is really a holistic way of life, which includes the study and the pursuit of trying to understand all that exists, all that is. And science, in its new era, in the modern period, becomes just that, but within certain parameters known as the scientific method, which means that you have to be able to, in your pursuit of knowing all that is, you have to be able to provide empirical evidence and use a certain kind of method in order to be able to theorize and then prove what you believe exists and what you believe is. But that really is what science is today, is an outgrowth of ancient philosophy. And so what I'd like to examine for the first evening is sort of the struggle, the challenge, the relationship that our great Torah scholars have with philosophy of the ancients, to see sort of sometimes there's a dance, an interplay, which makes some rabbis comfortable and makes other rabbis very uncomfortable in the interplay between Torah and philosophy, which is the precursor, the forerunner to modern science, and see how we can apply that to our relationship to science as Torah Jews today. Now, we also need to identify the differences between modern science and ancient and medieval philosophy. On the one hand, we could argue that science today is potentially more at odds with a Torah worldview than ancient philosophy is. For the simple reason that modern science today is exclusively interested in that which is empirically demonstrable, that which I can be able to show exists in a laboratory, or shows that exists with a telescope, or shows that exists with a microscope. And if I cannot demonstrate the existence of something using scientific method, then I have no evidence that such a thing exists, which leads some to, by extension, to suggest that it doesn't exist, period. And this, for many, has become a point of tension between modern science and Torah, because Torah is predicated on our belief in the existence of things, and certainly one thing that is completely not demonstrable, which is God. God has never been, it has never been proven that God exists. We have many things that point to the existence of a supreme being, a sentient being, but we cannot prove it in a laboratory. And by that argument, there have been those who have suggested that there are irreconcilable differences between modern science and Torah. By contrast, ancient and medieval philosophy, before the advent of the scientific method of providing empirical proofs, was based on reason. In other words, you argued for the existence or the reality of something or some concept, not based upon your empirical demonstration of the existence of that thing, but rather by using the intellect to be able to come to certain conclusions. So instead of using empirical proofs, you used proofs through induction, proofs through deduction, and were able to argue for the existence or to be able to demonstrate certain models that exist because they are logical and they are reasonable. And this is the way that Plato and Aristotle worked. This is the way the medieval philosophers who built on their theories worked. And many of the accepted ideas of physics and metaphysics, astronomy and mathematics, were all predicated on exercises of the mind and not exercises of the laboratory. And in that sense, ancient and medieval philosophy has more in common with Torah, a Torah methodology and a Torah worldview than modern science does. And so therefore perhaps one could argue that even if we find a synthesizing of Torah and philosophy, it'll be much harder to synthesize Torah and modern science. But on the other hand, one could also argue that it is easier to reconcile Torah and science than it is to reconcile Torah and philosophy. Let me argue for the opposite side. The opposite side is that philosophia, philosophy, is not merely a set of disciplines, but rather it is a holistic, or it professes to be, to the ancients and to the medieval followers of philosophy, a holistic way of life, a holistic system of living. Aristotle and many other Greek philosophers talked about a term called eudaimonia, which is a sense of well-being. How does a person achieve a sense of well-being in life? And for Aristotle, the means of reaching a sense of well-being is the attainment of excellence in reason. And so for Aristotle, it was important to be a philosopher not just because a person may be curious, but rather your whole raison d'etre, the whole purpose of your existence, is to, as a rational being, to attenuate and perfect your intellect to the highest degree possible. And once you've achieved that objective, you've achieved your purpose in being, or you've achieved your purpose of living. And so it can be argued that ancient and medieval philosophy is directly at odds to Torah, because Torah professes a different purpose in being, and that is to serve the Ribbono Shel Olam, to do his mitzvos. Whereas modern science has never professed that its objective is to provide a person with a purpose in being. Science is a discipline that helps an individual as a tool to understand all that exists around him. And certainly there's virtue, because science builds upon ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy to have that same goal of eudaimonia, but it doesn't necessarily profess in the same kind of doctrinal way that this is the purpose of my existence. So I hope I've presented to you the two sides of the coin, that on the one hand, it is easier to reconcile from a disciplinary standpoint Torah and philosophy than it is to reconcile Torah and science. but from a sense of a doctrinal perspective, as far as what forms a person's purpose in being, since modern science is not, no one says, I live because I shouldn't say no one, but it would be unusual for a person to say that my whole purpose of existence is to work in a laboratory, but rather it's a much more utilitarian profession, which is to be able to get certain facts out of the lab in order to be able to do something with those facts, but not necessarily to provide me with a sense of purpose and a sense of being and a sense of fulfilling what I was created for. But we don't talk about it in those terms in the modern period. So those are just a couple of things that I'd like you to think about when we talk about our inquiry towards the medieval's approach to Torah and science. Now, I will open up the floor in a little bit, but since our time is limited, I want to go into some of our medieval thinkers. The truth of the matter is that Chazal have been speaking to us in philosophical terminology from time immemorial. Our prophets have been speaking to us and revealing to us secrets of the world and science from time immemorial. That would be the way, if you were to ask Maimonides, what is the relationship between science and Torah, he would tell you, what do you mean, what is the relationship? The two are one and the same. You see, because for the Rambam, inquiry about all that exists is an integral part of what Torah knowledge, of the knowledge that God wishes to impart to every single human being. God created a world, and he created the world with the objective that people of sentience and intellect should be able to discover as much as possible about God through an investigation of the world which he created. Now, this leads the Rambam to look at the structured system of science and philosophy that exists in his time, and to say, that's part of us, that's part of Torah. When the Rambam looks at the writings of Aristotle, which were the most readily available writings to him in his time period, he's living in the 12th century, he's living in an Arabic milieu, in an Islamic milieu in Egypt, and Aristotle's writings have been translated into Arabic. They have been embellished by great Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and like Al-Farabi. And as a result, he has the most exposure to that school of philosophy. But it's not just philosophy. As I mentioned, philosophy in the times of the Rambam, Aristotle is writing books on physics and metaphysics. He's writing De Anima about the human body. He is studying ideas about the human mind, about the construct of all that is. And so for the Rambam, to read those texts is actually to engage in an endeavor that the Ribono Shalom wants. It's actually even part of Torah for the Rambam. And I will demonstrate this to you by us just like taking a cursory look at the Rambam's introduction to his Mishneh Torah. I shouldn't say his introduction to the Mishneh Torah, but the first 4 chapters of the Mishneh Torah. Many of you know that the Rambam wrote a work called the Mishneh Torah. It's considered to be his magnum opus. It's the most important work that he wrote. And if I were to ask you, what is the objective or what is the theme of Mishneh Torah, what would most of you say? What would you say what was the Rambam trying to do in writing the Mishneh Torah? What is the Mishneh Torah of the Rambam, of Maimonides? Can anyone sell it to me in one phrase? What is it doing?
Codifying Jewish law.
Codifying Jewish law. Thank you. Codifying Jewish law. That's what the Rambam is doing when he writes the Mishneh Torah. What's quite peculiar about that is that the very first section of Mishneh Torah is what he calls Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the laws of the foundations of the Torah, the laws of Torah foundations. And in writing the laws of Torah foundations, the first 4 chapters of that very first section of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the Rambam sets out to describe 4 different, very important topics. He describes the existence and essence of God and his unity. He describes what metaphysical beings are that are devoid of physicality, meaning that he describes angelic and celestial beings. That's in chapter 2. In chapter 3, he describes astronomy. He describes the planets and the movement in the orbits of the planets and all of the other celestial bodies. And in chapter 4, he describes the elements and how the elements make compound elements and how we have all of the physical reality that exists on our planet. And the Rambam makes an interesting statement, which I'd like to read with you. When you read the things that the Rambam has written in those 4 chapters, you'll be at a loss to discover where he finds them in the Talmud. Because the reality is they are not in the Talmud. The reality is that everything that the Rambam writes in the first 4 chapters of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah is based on Aristotelian science. His explanation of metaphysics, which is the first 2 chapters of talking about God and celestial beings, and the chapters 3 and 4, which is physics, describing physical bodies, both in the heavens and on earth, are all taken out of textbooks that the Rambam had in his time about science. What science didn't exist, about philosophy, which is really a holistic discipline of all that is. And if you take a look at your handout, at the end of chapter 2 of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, I have it here translated in English, so I'll just read it. In Halacha 11 he says, the concepts that we have mentioned about the subject matter in these 2 chapters are like a drop from the sea when compared to what is necessary to explain in this matter. The explanation of all the fundamental principles of these 2 chapters is referred to as Ma'aseh Merkava, is referred to as the act of the chariot. Now, what is the act of the chariot? So the Rambam is referring to a Mishnah in Chagiga. The Mishnah in Chagiga tells us that there are 2 subjects that may not be expounded upon publicly. Those 2 subjects are Ma'aseh Bereshis and Ma'aseh Merkava, the act of creation and the act of the chariot. Now, what does that mean, that they cannot be expounded upon publicly, and what are these 2 subjects? So, from the Gemara and from the commentaries, Ma'aseh Bereshis simply means what went into the creation of the world, what existed before creation, the technical aspects of how God created the world ex nihilo from nothing, and how everything coalesced and formed from the initial creation. Those are things that we're not supposed to expound upon publicly, only to private individuals. Ma'aseh Merkava is even more esoteric, says the Mishnah, and therefore even to an individual one should not teach it unless the person himself is of very, very high caliber of proficiency of study. And that is expounding upon the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, which describes a very unusual and very foreign description of the Godhead and of the heavenly entourage and what is surrounding God in what is known as his chariot. And you can look at the first chapter of Ezekiel, and even if you read it with the finest of translations, it won't make very much sense. But it's a vision that the prophet Yechezkel has about what's going on in Shamayim. Okay? And so, first the Rambam says, what I've described for you in the first 2 chapters, which is all from an Aristotelian textbook, is what we would call Ma'aseh Merkava, the act of the chariot, the metaphysics of life. And Halacha 12, he says, the sages of the early generations commanded that these matters should not be explained except to a single individual at a time. He should be a wise man who can reach understanding with his powers of knowledge. I'm going to skip to the next paragraph. He says, these concepts are extremely deep, and not every person has the knowledge necessary to appreciate them. And therefore Solomon described them with the metaphor, lambs for your clothing. The root of lambs has the meaning hide. Thus our sages interpreted this metaphor to mean matters which are the secrets of the world will be your clothing. They will be for you alone, and you should not discuss them in public. Let's go now on to the end of chapter 4. After the Rambam has explained what the celestial planets and bodies are like, and he's described physical matter in this world, the Rambam goes and says as follows. In Halacha 10, in source number 2, he says, all these concepts that we have explained in this context are like a drop in a bucket. It's just very similar to what he had said at the end of chapter 2. They are deep matters. Nevertheless, their depth does not approach the depth of the subject matter of the first and second chapters, which would explain why the Rambam in the first analogy had said they're like a drop from the sea, and here he says it's a drop in the bucket. So a drop in the bucket is a larger percentage, I guess, than a drop in the sea. The explanation of all the subject matter in the third and fourth chapters is referred to as Ma'aseh Bereshit. The sages of the early generations commanded that these matters should not be expounded upon in public. Rather, a single individual should be informed about them and taught them. I'm going to ask you a very simple question. The simple question is, the Rambam seems to be contradicting what the Rabbi said to do. The Rabbi said, do not discuss these subjects in public, and the Rambam publishes a book that expounds upon these subjects quite explicitly. So how can he himself be aware of the rule and then violate it at the same time? Think about that for just a moment, and we'll explain how we reconcile that. If we go on in Halacha 11, he says, what is the difference between the subject matter of Maaseh Mekava and the subject matter of Maaseh Bereshit? So the subject matter of Maaseh Merkava should never be expounded upon, and whereas Maaseh Bereshit may be taught to an individual, even though he is incapable of comprehending it with his own powers of understanding alone. Let's go on to Halacha 12. I'm just, for brevity, I need to go a little bit faster. Halacha 12. When a person meditates on these matters and recognizes all the creations, the angels, the spheres, man, and the like, and appreciates the wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He, in all these creations, he will add to his love for God. His soul will thirst and his flesh will long with love of God, blessed be He. So right away, we've seen why the Rambam feels that the study of philosophy, the study of physics and metaphysics, is of great value. What is the value of doing it? Because when you understand the world around you, when you understand God and His creations, you'll be filled with a greater appreciation of the Almighty and a great love for Him, for the amazing world that He has created. That, for the Rambam, is where it's at. That's the great benefit. He will stand in awe and fear from his humble, lowly, and base nature when he compares himself to one of the great and holy bodies. How much more so when comparing himself to the pure forms which are separate from matter and do not share any connection with it. He will see himself as a vessel full of embarrassment and shame, empty and lacking. There's also that sense of humility that one gets when one looks out at the stars and thinks about the majesty and the vastness of the universe. And so all of the things that are out there, and I am but a puny nothing, a speck on a speck, which is really what our planet Earth is like. So that's the other objective of studying the natural sciences, natural philosophy. Halacha 13. And this is also quite surprising, the Rambam says. The matters discussed in these 4 chapters concerning these 5 mitzvot are what the sages of the earlier generations termed the pardes. As they related, 4 entered into the pardes. Now, is anyone familiar with the story of the pardes? Where 4 great rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, Ben Zoma, and Ben Azai, entered into the pardes. And Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya became a heretic. Ben Zoma went insane. Ben Azai died. And only Rabbi Akiva was able to emerge unscathed after this experience of entering into the pardes. The word pardes literally means an orchard. Now, normally, it's a very famous story in the Gemara, so I know that many of you are familiar with the idea. It was put into a novelized form as a driven leaf by Milton Steinberg. You may have read that back in, I think he wrote it back in the 50s or something like that. But the point is that this is a story that for most people who read that Gemara are thinking about entering into the mystical realm, entering into something having to do with Kabbalah, entering into something having to do with great esoteric thought that transcends our universe. But for the Rambam, that's not at all what it is. Pardes means the study of Greek philosophy, the study of physics and metaphysics. Now, I should maybe perhaps provide the definition. The word physics, from an Aristotelian point of view, is the discipline that describes all that exists within our physical realm. Metaphysics is a discipline that describes all that exists beyond the physical realm, that transcends the physical realm, and that includes God himself, and it includes God's angelic entourage. Okay? And that's why the Rambam codifies these things. He says this is what the rabbis talked about when they talked about entering into the Pardes. Now, here too, you should challenge the Rambam and say, well, Rambam, if even 3 out of 4 of some of the greatest sages who ever lived ended up in tragic failure after entering into this Pardes, why are you bringing us in at the very beginning of your Mishnah Torah?
What was in the Pardes?
What was in the Pardes? It was some kind of, according to the Rambam, some kind of philosophic inquiry which led people to expansive realizations about reality, and for some they just went too far, and that's why one person became a heretic, another person died, and another person went insane. So does that mean that by studying the first 4 chapters of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, unless I'm a Rebbe Akiva, one of those 3 things will happen to me? Perhaps I shouldn't even begin this book, the Mishnah Torah. But let's see what the Rambam continues by saying. And in the last part of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the Rambam writes, top of page 2, I maintain that it is not proper for a person to stroll in the Pardes unless he has filled his belly with bread and meat. Now, what is bread and meat? Bread and meat refer to the knowledge of what is permitted and what is forbidden, and similar matters concerning other mitzvot, which means the rest of Mishnah Torah is bread and meat. After we got through explaining metaphysics and physics, I'm going to go into a discussion of the bread and meat, or the meat and potatoes, you could say, of depending upon what your preferred carbohydrate is, referring to really the very tachlis-oriented stuff of what Judaism is, the discussions of Abai and Rava. He says, even though the sages referred to these as a small matter in comparison to physics and metaphysics, the Rambam says, for our sages said, a great matter, this refers to Maisa Merkava. A small matter, this refers to the debates of Abai and Rava. So you see, the Rambam says, I can prove to you that what I'm doing in this work, Mishnah Torah, by introducing all of Torah with Greek metaphysics and physics, is the right thing to do. Because the Rabbi said that it is far greater, it is a far greater discipline of study, the study of metaphysics, than it is to study the laws of Abai and Rava. You know, what happens when a cow gores a mule, and who pays for what? That's what Havayis of the Abai and Rava means. Halachic discussions. So if the rabbis themselves place greater stock in metaphysics of Maisa Merkava than they do in halachic discussions, then I'm perfectly justified in making the preface of this work a discussion of metaphysics and physics. But still, the Rambam says it is nevertheless fitting for them to be given precedence because they settle a person's mind. It's better for you to study the small things first because they'll give you peace of mind. If you start getting too philosophical and you try to transcend the here and now and you try to untether yourself from the physical reality of what is at hand, of life at hand, so then you're not going to have peace of mind. Also, they are the great good which the Holy One, blessed be He, has granted to allow for stable living within this world and the acquisition of the life of the world to come. And he concludes by saying they can be known in their totality by the great and the small, man or woman, whether granted expansive knowledge or limited knowledge. Halachic discussions are much easier to understand. Metaphysics and physics cannot be grasped by everyone. Not everyone can be a great philosopher. Not everyone can be a great scientist. And therefore, says the Rambam, I'm therefore going to, it seems like he's saying, I'm going to be devoting the rest of this work towards the bread and meat of Torah, which is the small matters of halacha, of halachic practice. And yet you see very clearly why the Rambam places a discussion of metaphysics and physics as the very introduction, as the prefatory material for all of Torah practice. Because he says that's what the rabbis felt was the greatest knowledge known to man. So it's very clear from the Rambam that it's not a question of trying to artificially synthesize Torah and science. Torah equals science. One of the great disciplines of Torah is scientific inquiry, is philosophical inquiry. Now he says this also in other places as well, and I'll run through just a couple of places where the Rambam makes note of this. I think because of limitations on time, we're just going to look at the Rambam tonight, and then next week we'll continue this discussion by seeing other opinions about what philosophy or science really is in relationship to Torah. But for the Rambam, they are seamless. There is no difference between the two. Science or philosophy is merely one component of a much larger Torah, which includes science, philosophy, and the study of halakha, and the study of biblical text, and the study of Jewish thought, and. The question that I should leave you with, which is something that's sort of like an interesting mental experiment, is for the Rambam, can you take a science textbook into the bathroom with you? Right? For the Rambam, when you make Birkas HaTorah and all you plan to study is science, do you make a blessing on the Torah when you study science? Okay, so these are things that you should think about. I don't have an easy answer, although I know that one of my teachers, Menachem Kellner, wrote a whole article about this subject. So it's just something to think about. In the Rambam's introduction to his Mishnah commentary, which is quite lengthy, he writes that if you're interested in studying some of the esoteric ideas of metaphysics and physics, you have to look no further than looking at the writings of the sages. The only thing that is that with all esoteric writing, which the Rambam is a big fan of, the Rambam feels that the rabbis deliberately obfuscated knowledge that is contained in the Talmud. He says one of the functions of the Talmud, in addition to providing halachic knowledge, in addition to providing discussions and debates that occurred in the Beis Medrash during the period of Ravin and Ravashi, but another function of the Talmud is to provide us with esoteric knowledge in a very secretive way, in a very esoteric way. And the question is, why did Chazal decide to present us that information in that fashion? The Rambam writes in his Mishnah commentary for the very simple reason that not everyone is capable of processing that information in the appropriate fashion. There are many people who, when presented with certain ideas that are extremely metaphysical, transcendental in nature, they are going to perhaps have a distorted view of reality, which may even lead them astray. And so the rabbis were careful about this. They carefully clothed a lot of this information. And this goes back to our first question, which is that if the Rambam is aware of the Gemara that says that you're not supposed to be teaching these things publicly, why then does he set out to spend 4 chapters of the Mishnah Torah in describing in great detail the essence of God, the essence of his angels, the essence of the planetary bodies and of physical matter? The answer, it would seem to me, is that when the Rambam was very aware that when the rabbi said you're not supposed to exposit and discuss these things publicly, they were talking about entering a very deep recess of the Pardes. A very, very deep discussion which is very penetrating and goes down to some very, very difficult discussions. But a cursory knowledge is something that everyone should engage in. And that's why he puts it at the beginning of Mishnah Torah, not only because of its greater importance than halacha, but also because a cursory understanding of the world that is out there, the natural philosophy of what exists, is accessible to us all. We may not be able to delve further into God's unity, than those few sentences that the Rambam writes in the first chapter of Mishnah Torah, but at least an understanding, a cursory understanding, is something that's fine, and it doesn't require us to enter all the way into the Pardes. It just requires us to look at it from afar. And looking at it from afar is not a dangerous endeavor. There's something there for everyone. And in the same vein, the Rambam writes that when you explore some of the Agadic passages in the Talmud, and you find some outlandish stories, you find some things that seem to be totally running counter to that which is logical, like in the last couple of pages in the Daf Yomi, where the rabbis were talking about shadim, they were talking about demonic forces, and how to ward off shadim, and which seems to be something that is purely based in superstition and doesn't have any basis in reality, at least from a rational standpoint. The Rambam's response to that was that the rabbis are not foolish, the rabbis are geniuses, and they are masking esoteric knowledge of something far, far deeper in either metaphysics or physics. And they do it because that is the way of a wise man. A wise man speaks on multiple levels and communicates a deeper message to a deeper thinking individual, and a more surface message to a more superficial kind of person, a more superficial kind of thinker. So we're at the end of our discussion. We didn't get a chance to look at the Mor Nevuchim yet, but I'll take one or two questions, and then I'm going to send you on your way to the breakout sessions. If you want to, you can keep those packets. I'll make more copies next week. Any questions?
Well, I just...
Mrs. Friedman,
Yeah.
go ahead.
It bothers me. It just bothers me that Rambam would look back how many centuries? 5th century before the Common Era to the 12th century. That's 12.
It's a long time.
It's a long time. And to look up to Aristotle and so forth. And it just bothers me that Rambam would bring himself down, even though the Greeks were supposed to be, and they were in certain degrees, in certain sectors, they were wonderful, but nevertheless, that he would bring himself down.
The Rambam, well, it's one thing you need to know. The Rambam, in all likelihood, never studied Aristotle's writings directly. He may have had access to Arabic translations, but more likely he studied at Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. And they actually embellished a lot of what Aristotle wrote.
Sure.
So just to provide you with one example, the Rambam is cognizant of an entity called the Seichel HaPoel, which is what is called the active intellect. And if you read a lot of the writings of the Rambam and other medieval Jewish philosophers, you'll see this entity, some kind of angelic entity called the active intellect. And the active intellect is not really explicit in anything that Aristotle ever wrote, but it was developed. It was ideas that were developed over the centuries. It was almost like people took Aristotle's writings and wrote a Gemara on it. And that's what happened over the centuries. So you say it's not like the Rambam is going that far back. He's taking the contemporary textbooks of his time that describe nature.
The question is why?
Yeah, and he's using that as the...
You said philosophy is the love of knowledge. Yes, it is, love of knowledge. But it's not, that love of knowledge is not science. Because science, like you said, is provable. Okay?
Okay, the scientific method is what you're talking about. And again, I'm trying to distinguish between science as a discipline and scientific method, which is the way by which we discover what is science. And as I mentioned, you're right. Okay, so I'm saying you just go back to the first part of the lecture. Yeah. One other question if anyone would like to participate. Stan.
So where does the Zohar use that? Isn't that part of metaphysical also? Zohar.
Well, that's a very good question. You see, the Zohar is almost the anti-philosophy of Judaism. Because what the Zohar sets out to do is describe the metaphysical reality, but in a completely different way from the way that the Greek philosophers set out to describe it. And as we will see from one of our commentaries, they describe the Zohar as being of a much higher or deeper understanding of the metaphysics than the Greeks were ever capable of doing, because it transcends a rational kind of construct, which is what Greek philosophy strives to do. Aristotle, in describing God and in describing what exists beyond the physical reality, used rational extrapolations of his observations to describe that. The Zohar does not use those kinds of rational extrapolations to describe the metaphysics of the spheros, but rather uses some other traditional Zohar is Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah means tradition. So it's the whole idea of Zohar is predicated upon receiving a tradition, an oral tradition that is not predicated on rational thought, but is predicated on the Word of God being given from generation to generation.